Hello, so I'm Dave Reay from the University of Edinburgh, and I'm going to give you a hopefully reasonably short overview of one of my favourite topics in terms of methane. And I'm doing this because I think it's going to be a major part of what is discussed at COP28 coming up in Dubai. And I wanted to give a bit of context about why it's so important as a greenhouse gas, and what might be discussed in terms of outcomes and actions. So methane, I just mentioned, is a really powerful greenhouse gas. It's second only to carbon dioxide. In terms of the warming, it's caused from human activity. So about 30% of the warming we've seen since before the Industrial Revolution is down to our emissions of this greenhouse gas methane. It's really important not just for warming, but it's also a key contributor to poor air quality as well. So it has a real big impact on human health. And so cutting it makes really good sense for both those reasons in terms of climate and human health and air quality. And that's why at COP26, we saw a thing called the Global Methane Pledge come together. So that was led by the European Union and the United States. And that pledge was that any nation signing up to the pledge would be part of cutting methane emissions by 30% by 2030 compared to what they were in 2020. A really important one in terms of tackling climate change and as part of delivering on the Paris climate goals. So in terms of limiting warming, ideally to just 1.5 degrees. If I go to the statement on the Global Methane Pledge and do Google it, it has some amazing stats just in terms of if they delivered this at a global scale. So there are quite a few signatories already that encompass about half of global methane emissions from human activities. But if they got everyone on board, and hopefully they will get some really big emitters on board at COP28, it says, the Global Methane Pledge has the potential to reduce warming by at least 0.2 degrees centigrade by 2050. And that is crucial, obviously, in getting us closer to the Paris climate goals. They're really important in terms of warming, and prevent annually 26 million tonnes of crop losses. So again, that's due to both poor air quality and to climate change impacts. 255,000 premature deaths. 775,000 asthma-related hospitalizations, again, very much related to not just the warming impact, but the poor air quality, and 73 billion hours of lost labor due to extreme heat. So I guess it's one of those gases where there are many advantages to cutting emissions. So why aren't we doing it faster? Why hasn't everyone signed up for this? And one of the key things with methane is it has multiple sources, and some of them are quite tricky in terms of cutting the emissions. So if we think about all the human-induced methane emissions from around the world, a lot of them come from fossil fuels, but not necessarily from burning them. It's actually the extraction of fossil fuels. So things like coal mining are one of the biggest sources of methane emissions to the atmosphere. And they're called fugitive emissions because basically you're mining the coal, but there's lots of methane, so natural gas associated with the coal in the ground. And when you dig it out, you take the coal out, but the methane escapes into the atmosphere. So it's why it's called fugitive. It's kind of escaping. And it's something which obviously happens when we extract coal, as we do around the world, in huge amounts. There are ways to limit that, but it can be quite expensive. So we have this long established, I guess, science around coal bed methane. So basically, before you even extract the coal, extracting as much methane out of it as possible, because methane is natural gas. It's a really important fuel source. So actually capturing it makes good, in theory, economic sense, as well as helping in terms of reducing the climate and air quality impacts. But actually having the infrastructure in place to do that capture and the regulation to make companies capture the methane before they extract the coal, for instance, is certainly not a universal thing at the moment. So we get a lot of methane from coal extraction, and also the processing. When you pulverize coal before you burn it, that emits even more methane that's associated kind of within the coal itself. Oil is often associated with gas, so methane, and when we extract oil, then there's the risk that methane escapes as well, and you'll quite often see images of flaring. So essentially, where you've got oil extraction going on, you'll see the methane is dangerous. Same in coal mines. If you've got high concentrations of methane, you want to get rid of it because it might explode. So in coal mines, you vent the air, so there's ventilation air methane as they're working on underground coal mines, is a big source of methane. But likewise with oil extraction, the methane that comes up, if you've not got the facilities to capture that associated methane and use it, then it's often flared into the atmosphere or emitted, so vented directly into the atmosphere. So you're wasting this energy source and creating extra warming and air quality impacts. So one of the reasons we haven't got rid of these methane emissions from the fossil fuel sector around the world is that cost and that infrastructure and the regulation. And the Methane Pledge, if it can attract all nations into that, then that will help tighten up the rules, make sure there's better investment in terms of low methane fossil fuel extraction where it's still happening, making sure things like pipelines for our gas networks are really well maintained, that leaks are detected and plugged really quickly. All of that can help reduce methane emissions to the atmosphere. Another big source of methane emissions, and again, one of the reasons why that Global Methane Pledge hasn't got all nations on board yet, is livestock agriculture. So you probably, maybe at school, you heard people laughing about the fact that methane is from cow farts. It's not really from cow farts, but it is from cow burps. So basically ruminants like cows, sheep, goats, as part of their digestion in their rumen, so in their stomach, they break down what they've eaten, so plant material, and as a byproduct of that, methane is produced, and they burp most of it out. Most of it doesn't come out the back end, but that's a really big source of methane emissions. But reducing that is again difficult. You've got lots of these, so a diffuse source, so loads of livestock around the world emitting methane. You can reduce it by improving their feed quality. You can reduce it by making sure that the animals are really healthy. You can add things to the food. All sorts of things have been tried in terms of feed additives to reduce methane emissions, everything from garlic and tea through to things like cinnamon, to reduce how much methane is produced in their guts and so how much they belch. But one of the most powerful ways to reduce methane emissions from livestock globally is to have fewer livestock, and obviously that's very controversial. Livelihoods depend on it, and so many nations where these ruminant livestock are the main source of methane emissions, pledging to cut their emissions by 30% by 2030 doesn't really fit with the reality on the ground in terms of what's possible. So that's one of the other reasons for reticence. Other sources of methane emissions, and there are many, and that's part of the challenge, is there's not just one simple answer to this, is rice cultivation. So rice tends to be grown in flooded fields, and those wet soils that the rice plants are growing in, they are perfect for producing methane. So basically you have these bugs, microorganisms in the soil, in these low oxygen environments under the flooded water, the rice paddies, where they'll produce methane and it will bubble up and diffuse into the atmosphere. There are some really effective ways to limit that in terms of draining the rice paddies, using varieties which are more able to grow in low water conditions, but also the normal varieties, just managing the water so that you dry out the soil on a regular basis can reduce the methane emissions quite radically. But again, that needs investment in terms of training, it needs regulation, and it also needs investment in terms of some of the equipment and technology to allow that water table, the amount of water in rice systems, to be controlled. The final one I'll mention, because this is one that is again really diffuse, so it's all over the place, is waste management. So when we throw away a banana skin and it goes into the waste stream, that can often end up in conditions like say a landfill site, like we have a lot of still in Europe. If that banana skin is in there, it might rot down and again produce methane in those low oxygen conditions, and that methane can work its way up through the soil and escape to the atmosphere. Again, we've had some really good success in terms of those kind of systems in some countries with putting in methane capture, so capturing that methane and using it as a fuel source before it escapes to the atmosphere, but also using the soil itself to actually buffer the methane. So there are another set of bugs called methanotrophs, so methane eating bugs, which will eat the methane before it gets out into the atmosphere, so they can be really effective. But again, to see that around the world and include things like wastewater and sewage management, which are again major sources of methane emission, it needs investment, it needs capacity in terms of skills, it often needs regulation. All of these things come together in terms of can we get a global methane pledge with all nations on board? It kind of fits back to that COP ideal of cooperation, of sharing technology, of investing in countries who don't have the capacity to capture their methane or mitigate it at the moment, for the global benefits that then accrue. So look out for the global methane pledge discussions in COP28. I think they are moving in the right direction in terms of some key countries like China and India committing to just reporting their methane emissions, which is a really important thing, understanding what is being emitted at the moment, so then you can manage it, and then looking to what commitments they can make to reduce those methane emissions. It's complicated because of all the sources and because of all the livelihoods and structural issues that different countries have. But really, methane, it's one of those where if we can meet the global methane pledge targets, it will make such a big impact in terms of getting us closer to those Paris climate goals, but also there's huge benefits in terms of human health, reduced crop impacts, the rest. So yeah, here's to more methane mitigation and hopefully a substantive increase in action on cutting methane emissions from COP28. Thank you.